As we prepare to tackle some of the important issues around community policing in our town hall event tonight, we've put together a panel of experts today for a conversation about the broken windows policing strategies. The essential theory behind the policy, which began being implemented nationwide in the early 80s, suggests that increased police presence within so-called disruptive environments prior to an incident would in theory reduce potential disruption over the long haul.
Well, it's that long haul that we're about to talk about now with Professor Alex Vitale, who teaches in the sociology department at Brooklyn College. He's also the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, a book that deals with the rise of broken windows policing. Welcome back to BK Live. We'll also be speaking with Nahal Zamani, an advocacy program manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she directs CCR's advocacy and campaigns. And finally, we welcome back Anthonine Pierre, lead community organizer at the Brooklyn Movement Center, working on issues of anti-street harassment and police accountability in central Brooklyn. And welcome all. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Alex, why don't we start with you? You literally wrote the book on this broken windows policing. Take us back to the beginning. What was the original definition or intent of broken windows policing, and how has it evolved through the years?
Broken windows as a theory emerges in the early 80s, and it's really an attempt to explain what we can do to restore a lot of urban neighborhoods that are in decline. The thing is, it was written by very conservative social theorists in the total absence of any evidence. It was really a hypothesis that was written about in a popular magazine. It was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was not based on any real research. And they were reacting to the outcomes of the social movements of the 60s and 70s that had really changed social relations in the U.S. for blacks, for women, for gays and lesbians. And what they said is the reason our cities are disorderly is there's too much social freedom. We got rid of Jim Crow and all these other things. And what we need to do is use police to put the cork back in the bottle, to clamp down on these disorderly behaviors through aggressive and often what turned out to be zero-tolerance policing measures.
Okay. Now, Nahal, can you pick us up from there with the zero-tolerance policing and also how that sort of morphed into Stop-and-frisk and its impact on the community?
Yeah, Stop-and-frisk has been a program that's been in existence for decades, but really taken on by the architects of broken windows policing and ramped up, especially in the 90s and into the 2000s. And my organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, in 1999, when Amadou Diallo was shot by a unit that was roving of the police department, were asked to file a lawsuit challenging that unit's use of stop and frisk. We settled with them a couple of years later, but as we all know, the number of stops and frisks dramatically increased up to an all-time high of nearly 700,000. So we headed back to court a couple of years later. We filed Floyd versus the City of New York. And in that lawsuit, we alleged that the NYPD was engaging in a practice of unconstitutional stops and frisks and engaging in racial discrimination. And a federal judge ruled in our case a couple of years later, really validating that and validating the concerns of many New Yorkers who have been outcrying police abuse in their communities.
Now, I was looking at the numbers from one of your articles that you cited. It said that 0.1% of 2.4 million stop and frisk between 2009 and 2012 led to the conviction of a violent crime. Just 0.1%.
It's so low, whether it's guns or weapons being seized, whether it's actual numbers of summonses and tickets or arrests that are happening as a result of stops. Even though stops have dramatically decreased, well, recorded stops have dramatically decreased, and we could talk about that. Still, the majority of stops are not resulting in any further law enforcement action, which means that folks are still innocent and they're still being targeted by stops and frisks by the NYPD. And even now, with this decrease that's been documented, still blacks and Latinos make the bulk of folks that are targeted by the NYPD for stops.
Yeah, Anthonine, as a community organizer, I'm wondering if you can speak to that, what people think of stop and frisk out there. I mean, let's talk about how Donald Trump seems to be doubling down on support for this. And, I think some people may think, well, sure, you're a you're this white guy billionaire, who isn't really affected by it in the same way maybe some other people in Brooklyn might be. Do you have any thoughts on this, please?
And I also want to preface that with the fact that Donald Trump seems to espouse the idea that stop and frisk still works. So can you speak to that?
Well, and he also seems to espouse the idea that
it's unconstitutional.
Still a widely used practice, right? So the ways in which Black and brown folks are being stopped in Brooklyn mean that cops don't really identify themselves, and they're able to really search pretty much anyone who they think might be doing a crime, which with a lot of bias really just ends up being like any Black or brown person who's just walking around. And what we're really trying to do, Brooklyn Movement Center, with the Right to Know Act, is to be able to pass a city council bill that says, look, if you're going to stop a person, they have the right to find out who you are, to get your badge number, and to get the phone number to call the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And if you are going to search someone, they have to consent to that search, right? Like, what does it mean for it to be legally required for a police officer to say, hey, I would like to search you, you have the right to consent to that search or not? How would having police officers do that more change the way that police target Black and brown folks, and actually possibly decrease the number of stops and improve the relationships between Black and brown folks and police?
Well, you know, I have to say that every single day when I'm getting off the train, when I'm walking out the turnstile, I'm looking for that male or female that is on their way to work, on their way to an interview, and is patiently waiting for somebody to let them in. Like, I always do that without fail. In preparation for this segment, I did just reading, and it said that 92% of people arrested for jumping turnstiles, 92% are people of color. And of course, jumping turnstiles is the most common sort of misdemeanor that police give out. But, if you want to stop people jumping the turnstile, why don't you just put a police officer right there at the gate? People won't jump the turnstile, but that's not what they do. They have the officers just wait sort of on the side, and then it's just numbers. I mean, 2,291 white people were ticketed, as compared to 26,678 Black, Hispanic, and Asians during a 4-year period.
Well, the Police Reform Organizing Project released a report yesterday that included those numbers and also numbers for a whole host of broken windows-oriented offenses. And what they found is that depending on the offense, 80 to 95% of the people who have these punitive interactions with the police are Black and brown people. So this broken windows enforcement really is reserved for certain neighborhoods, certain populations, certain demographics, and it is punitive. You're absolutely right. If the goal of the policy was to reduce the infractions, for one thing, they would need to do something about the fact that it's $5.50 for a round-trip ticket on the subway. And for people who are looking for a job, who are trying to get to an appointment of some kind, who aren't part of the Wall Street miracle, that's a lot of money. And our social systems and infrastructure investments have broken down to such a degree that we basically have criminalized people who cannot afford public transit to the tune of thousands of people every week.
And it still begs the question, would cops stop people so often if they had to identify themselves every single time that they had an interaction with a person?
Yeah, and the thing about broken windows policing and the way that stops are practiced here in New York is that it is overly enforced on the bodies of people of color. And this is something we have to think about, is that what are the ramifications on people's lives? What are the ramifications of getting targeted for jumping a turnstile when all you're doing is trying to get to services that will make you healthy in some cases? So we really have to think about why this vision of policing that's been brought up by police commissioners, both previous and current, and we have to think about what are the ramifications on people's lives. How are people's lives getting disrupted? Mm-hmm. How are their livelihoods being disrupted? And is this really about safety, or is this something else?
And on that note, let's talk about community policing. Alex, why don't we go to you? How would you define it, and is it a viable option?
Yeah, so Loretta Lynch announced yesterday that she was putting $120 million into police reform, and what that meant to her was money to hire more police across the country to do community policing. My main problem with what they mean by community policing is it's turning community problems into police problems. It's defining the lack of affordable housing, the lack of mental health care, the lack of youth jobs as crime problems to be solved by more broken windows policing. And that is the really sad thing. We've had 3 years of uprisings about excessive, heavy-handed, and brutal policing, and what we're getting from the federal government is more money for more police to turn more community problems into police problems.
Okay, so what are the next steps?
Well, we really need to actually deal with the way that police are interacting with people when you think about community policing. So the way that we often see community policing is like basketball tournaments or like national night out, having a big bungee house for kids to jump in. And this amounts to putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, right? If I'm being abused by the police, if I'm being harassed, if I'm being followed by the police on a daily basis, I'm not going to want to play in your basketball tournament. So we really need to think of how are we addressing the actual problem, and then we can think about, well, how can we do these things like the basketball tournaments that are fine and great, but really don't address the chief issue.
And I would just add to that that New York and the country is in this crisis around policing. We are having very necessary conversations around police violence. We need to have bold, innovative solutions. The Right to Know Act, which is pending in the City Council, is one of those steps that would really dramatically change the daily interactions that people have with the police and shift accountability back into the hands of New Yorkers where it should be. That, coupled with this very long, tedious process around reforming the NYPD around their stop-and-frisk programs, these are real ways that we can shift the balance to talk about accountability and justice and not have lip service for interventions that we know aren't really successful or getting at the core issue.
Well, speaking of just paying a sort of lip service, a few years ago, New York seemed to be at the forefront of adopting body cameras for their police force. But I was just reading an article this morning that says, 4 years later, that is not the case. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, this is a problem. Of course, the police union has never been happy about having body cameras on officers, and they've really resisted this. And the police department itself, I think, is not enthusiastic about it. They've hidden those concerns around talk about, well, managing the technology and what do we do with the data, et cetera. But I think it's part of a pattern of trying to avoid accountability. What I would just add is that in addition to accountability for officers that we've discussed, the Right to Know Act, we need more political accountability. Because the police didn't invent the war on drugs. The police did not invent broken windows policing. This was the invention of politicians who then sent the police to work to carry these things out. And we need to be tougher about holding accountable police who say the solution to our reforms is more police, more money for training, more money for police technology, instead of dealing with the real roots of neighborhood problems.
Well, I mean, we could talk about this all day. There is the town hall event tonight. I'm just plugging that and plugging how much I'm enjoying the conversation. What I want to talk about is how will the community play a role in this change? What do we tell New Yorkers, for example?
So New Yorkers do have a formal role in the reform process around stop and frisk. That was enshrined by the court in this really outstanding order. And it's part of a new wave across the country, thinking about why it's so important that communities have input and really some decision-making power and participation into the policies that impact their lives. So around stop and frisk in the coming months, New Yorkers will hear about opportunities to weigh in on the possibility of new reforms to the stop and frisk program, which is great. And one of the named stakeholders to that process is Communities United for Police Reform, which is a broad-based coalition of which the Brooklyn Movement Center and the Center for Constitutional Rights are members. And they're a named stakeholder in that process. And I think New Yorkers have demonstrated time and time again that they want change. They vote with that, indicating that they want candidates that represent them, that are really committed to police reform beyond lip service, but in action. And we have a majority support behind this Right to Know Act, which is a real clear step that the City Council can take.
Just want to get your final thoughts. We only have a minute left. I mean, not just these glaring human rights violations, but how are we going to hold the police accountable? Because it seems as though a lot of that is not being done.
Well, we need to have a system that's interested in holding police accountable. So you have, for example, in the case of Eric Garner's murder, you have Ramsey Orta, who took the video that we all saw going to jail for 4 years for like unrelated charges. But then you have Daniel Pantaleo, the chief cop who was involved in this murder, was actually not even indicted. So there's a question here of like, what does our criminal justice system look like around policing, and how is our criminal justice system actually interested in holding police accountable? What are the mechanisms for that? And are we holding our elected officials accountable to making sure that those things happen?
And Pantaleo's actually making more money than when he was cop.
Yes.
Final thoughts, sir?
Just politicians include district attorneys, the mayor, the city council. We have to take a close look at all these people who keep saying that law and order, tough on crime, more police are the solution to a lack of affordable housing, mental health services, failed schools, et cetera.
Well, when you say law and order, I hear something else. But thank you so much, and we do
bet.
appreciate you.
Thank you.